The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
It's not started. Oh. Okay, hi. Sorry if there were any confusion there at the very beginning as we were trying to get this to start. My name is Meredith Smith. I am the Assistant Provost for Title IX and Clery Compliance here at Tulane. And I want to welcome you to this webinar that we're having to discuss preventing and responding to sexual violence at Tulane. So for those of you who have children who are coming here or family members who are coming to Tulane, we want to tell you a little bit about what we do here at the university to deal with these issues. I am not alone, though. I am joined by my colleague, Julia Broussard. Julia, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. So I am the Assistant Director for Case Management and Victim Support Services here at Tulane, out of the Division of Student Affairs. And I work really closely with Meredith and a lot of other colleagues on our campus to ensure that we're providing support to our students and preventing sexual violence.
Yeah. So the two of us today are going to walk you on through the national landscape and conversations right now that are being held about sexual violence on college campuses. Then we're going to focus in on Tulane to talk about how we respond to issues of sexual violence and how we support victim survivors here at the university. Next, we'll dive on into the policies and procedures regarding sexual violence on our campus. And finally, really dig on into the efforts to prevent and end sexual violence on our campus and how you and your student can contribute to a safer Tulane. With that, then, let's start in and talk about this larger national landscape. I think that the issue of sexual violence on college campuses is one that has been really at the forefront for the past several years. It is a really concerning and grim picture with the fact that we're looking at rates that are at least 1 in 4 undergraduate women who experience sexual assault in their time at college, if not higher. Also, we see really high rates of sexual harassment too. So this is an issue that we allowed to fester for a really long time. And because of that, then it's a very large one. But instead of getting incredibly frustrated about this, we choose to act. So this really starts with Title IX. Hopefully, this isn't the first time that you have had a conversation about Title IX in your educational setting, because this applies not just to colleges, but elementary schools and high schools, as well as us. Title IX is a very broad piece of civil rights legislation. It's only 37 words. Everything that's here up on the screen is what is in the legislation. It just says that within educational programs or activities, that the people in these activities will not be discriminated on the basis of sex. That's it. So if you look at the regulations within Title IX, they're actually even more clear. They tell us that the job of Title IX is to end sexual discrimination. And when we talk about sexual discrimination, it's not just treating people differently on the basis of sex. It's that there are specific forms of sexual discrimination, in particular, sexual harassment and sexual violence. So what Title IX is asking of us is that we have a duty to respond to incidents that we learn about. So when we learn about sexual discrimination, harassment, or violence, we must take immediate action to eliminate it, prevent its reoccurrence, and address its effects. So part of those requirements look like having policies against these issues, that we all must employ a Title IX coordinator, like me, and that we must have procedures for students to be able to tell us about what happened. And I think the most critical thing is that we must be able to respond. So let's turn to that and look at how Tulane responds to sexual violence the support that we give and the resources that we have at the university. Julia, I want to let you take it away.
Sure. So when we think about how universities are responding to sexual violence, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind is the judicial. How are universities adjudicating these cases? Are they expelling students who have committed an act of sexual violence? Are they referring it to the criminal justice system? Those are a lot of questions and kind of immediate responses that I see in the national discourse. But really what we focus on first at Tulane is how can we help the student who's been impacted, the victim or survivor, however they're choosing to identify. And what I find from my experience, and I'm sure my colleagues would say the same, is that a lot of times when we're meeting with a student after they've been assaulted, they are feeling lost and confused and just kind of unsure about how they should even be feeling and processing this experience. They don't know whether or not they should report it. I sometimes see students who immediately know I want to report this to the police or to the university, but that's the exception. The normal response is usually I have no idea what I want to do, or I know on some level I quote unquote should report it, but here's all the barriers I'm hitting up against. And so usually as a starting point, my office works with students on just first and foremost, do you feel safe? Do you feel supported? And so there's some accommodations that we can put in place to help with safety concerns students have. But we can also get a student connected with a therapist. So we have a really great relationship with our counseling center on campus. And so one of the first things my office will do is offer to walk that student over to our counseling center for a walk-in appointment. So they don't even have to wait to see someone and talk and start processing how they're feeling and processing this experience. We really try to give the student a menu of options that are available to them and really ask them, like, where do you want to go? What's going to be the best way for you to heal? Because first and foremost, what we want is for our students to be able to process what happened to them and to heal from it. And healing looks different for everyone. So for some people, that does involve reporting to the police and or reporting to the university. And my office always makes it clear to students, if reporting is the right thing for you, then we're here with you every step of the way. We're here to literally or figuratively hold your hand while you're meeting with the police or when you're meeting with the DA's office. We're here to help you find an advisor for your conduct case and make sure that there is a warm handoff from my office to our Office of Student Conduct. But I always ask students if they're thinking about going through that process, what do you hope to get out of it and how is that going to help you heal? And so we just want to make sure students are going through that process for the right reason and that they're going to get something out of it that helps them in their journey to becoming whole again. A lot of times what we hear from students is that they're, like I said, struggling with whether or not they want to report it, but they are interested in accommodations such as having us email their professors and just letting the professors know they've been a victim of crime. We don't go into details, but maybe asking the professors for some accommodations like an extension on a paper or their understanding on the student missing class that week. Students oftentimes have overlapping social circles with their perpetrator, and so we may need to take some steps to try to really limit contact between them. So if they're members of a student organization together, working out a way for that student to participate in that student organization comfortably. Because as Meredith said earlier, Title IX is about making sure that they can fully enjoy the benefits of their education and all the opportunities available here at Tulane. And so we don't want to see an assault hinder that for someone. They may also have some specific concerns about direct contact with the perpetrator or the accused student, whether that's in person or email, phone call, or being contacted by that person's friends. And so we can do things like issuing something called a no contact order between the two students, which bars them from having contact with one another. We can move around a student's class schedule if they're in the same class as their assailant. We can make accommodations in the residence hall so that they're not crossing paths in the residence hall. They don't live in the same residence hall. Um, and finally, if the student is going through the conduct process, we can sometimes come to an outcome where the perpetrator is totally removed from our community. But again, that's not what healing looks like for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to note that we get a lot of questions about why aren't we just letting the criminal system handle this? This is a matter for the police and for the courts. And these are definitely crimes. Sexual violence is a crime. However, these also violate our student code of conduct. You're not allowed to harm other people. You're not allowed to punch them or kick them or rape them. So we have standards, and also there are things that we can do that the court can't. The court can't tell us to move a student from a class, and the court can't help us make housing arrangements. So if you are in the same residence hall as the person who hurt you, that you want to be moved to another hall, the court can't do that. And nor can a court suspend a student from our institution or expel them. Those are only decisions that the school can make. And that's why our process is so important, both the support that we give and our conduct process as well. So, but we want to talk a little bit more about the support available here at the university, because Julia's office, which is the Office of Case Management and Victim Support Services, is the primary, I think, first contact for victims at the institution. But we have a lot of resources. They're divided into two different categories. The first are confidential resources. That's exactly what that sounds like. These are the resources that if you tell them something, it stays there. It's like Resource Las Vegas. So here we've got our counseling and psychological services, which we call CAPS, the Student Health Center, the SAFE hotline, and then the line. Actually, Julia, would you talk a little bit about the SAFE hotline?
Sure. So the SAFE hotline is actually a peer hotline that operates 24/7 when school is in session. So it's not operating over breaks or the summer. And these are students who've gone through at least 40 hours of training on just being able to provide basic support and information to someone who's been a victim of sexual violence, dating domestic violence, stalking, or sexual harassment. So that's a really great place for a student to call if they don't feel ready to maybe take the step and go physically talk to a therapist. They certainly don't want to come talk to my office, which doesn't have the same level of confidentiality, but they just want some information about what kind of options are available to them. The SAFE hotline can provide some basic support and let them know about those options.
Yeah, and it's helpful sometimes for students to talk to another student.
Yeah.
Who can provide a lot of care and support. I mentioned the Student Health Center, but the Student Health Center will provide medical care to our victim survivors by giving them free STI testing, free pregnancy testing. I think we can give out free some medication also too.
Yeah, they can also, if a student comes within a certain time period after an assault, they can provide some prophylaxis medication to try to prevent pregnancy, STIs, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. There might be a question about, do we provide rape kits here on campus? Like most colleges, we do not conduct rape kits here because these are forensic medical examinations and require a lot more in terms of infrastructure than our university health clinic can provide. So what we do is that if a student says, I would like to go and receive a rape kit, staff members here at Tulane are happy to drive them on down the 1.5 miles to the University Medical Center, which is downtown. The University Medical Center has a dedicated SAFE unit that's sexual assault forensic exam. The nurses there are wonderful, very well trained, and this is what they do day in and day out. So they'll have a Tulane staff member, usually somebody from Julia's office. And then also the city provides medical advocates as well if a student wanted that. But student health is a place that we can do some first level care. The line is another 24/7 available resource. It's staffed by professional counselors, right, Julia?
Yes.
And that is also in service even when school is not in session. So during the summertime, you can call the line at 3 o'clock in the morning. The other types of resources are private resources. And these are ones where if students share information with these resources, there are duties to share that information. And the offices that have to know about these incidents are actually my office, and I am the office. I need to know about these incidents so that way I have a good picture of what's going on overall at Tulane. So we have an idea if there are issues that we need to address within larger communities, and also victim support services. So those are the two offices that we share information with always, but otherwise it's only on a need to know basis. Is there anything that you would add to that description of private resources?
No, but just I guess an example of that would be, we expect that if a student emails their professor and says, "Hi, Professor Smith, sorry I wasn't in class today. I was assaulted this weekend," that the professor is going to report that so that, again, my office can reach out and make sure that that student has the support that they need and understands their options. And then Meredith's kind of taking the maybe bird's eye view of all of that to say, are we seeing any patterns here? Or is there some immediate action that we need to take? And she can consult with others at the university to figure out what do we need to do to keep our community safe.
So the private resources that we offer for students are, of course, victim support services, Julia's office, our Tulane University Police. We do have our own dedicated police force. I'm sure that y'all have heard about this already. It is separate from New Orleans Police, and we do encourage students to call TUPD when they're on campus or even in our surrounding area here. They will respond and pretty quickly, and our officers are receive training on sexual violence, so that way they can provide compassionate care to students who need help. I'm a resource, of course. Students can call or walk in. And then lastly, the resident advisors within the halls. They also receive training on how to be caring, compassionate, and empathetic. So that way, if your student can't think of where else to go, they know their RA, and they know that their RA is there to help.
Yeah, and one thing I would add too about the private resources is that we have a very strong on-call system here on campus. So the resident advisors know that if a resident comes to them and says, "I think I may have been assaulted," they're going to call an on-call person for housing who's then going to activate my office so that we can offer resources. If it's a Saturday at 10 a.m., we can reach out. That student doesn't have to wait until Monday. Similarly, Tulane Police, if a student comes into their station and reports something, they are going to call the on-call person who's either with my office or with housing. We have a rotation. And again, they're just going to be outreach to that student to offer them resources and options right then and there. We never want someone to have to wait until Monday at 8:30 a.m. to get assistance.
Another way that students do tell us about incidents that they've experienced is through our online reporting form. This is tulane.edu/concerns. This is a really important form for everyone to know, regardless of if this is about sexual assault or not. As you can see up on the screen, that there are a multitude of reports that the Maxine system can be used for, and trust me, it is used for everything, including things that are not even listed here. Sometimes students will let us know that they are out of bathroom,
or the line at the coffee shop is too long.
Oh, this is maybe the best form to do that, but we'll get on that toilet paper then. But really, this is a great forum for community members to share with us issues of concern, including disclosures of sexual violence. So this is, if I were a professor and a student disclosed to me, this is where I would write up that disclosure so that way Julia's office is notified.
And I know we're talking a lot about sexual violence, kind of the most extreme examples of gender discrimination or sex discrimination, but also this forum, we see a lot of students using it to report maybe more minor incidents of sexual harassment. Like my professor sent out an email to all of the class that warned us all not to get raped on spring break. That's that's not something that I think the professor is probably well-meaning when he set that out, but there's an opportunity for a conversation there with that professor and to remind him of our policies against sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. And so I think I've seen our students have gotten really good about also using this to report some of those lower level things that maybe aren't going to result in someone being removed from our community, but are an opportunity to have a conversation or take some remedial action.
Yeah, that's very well said. There are a few things just to remember about this concern form. First is that anyone can submit. So even if we have had parents who have told us about incidents with their children, my daughter, my son experienced sexual assault, and I want you to know. But anyone can. We also will often receive reports from friends saying that their friend has experienced something. So this is a really great forum for that. You can choose, to submit these things anonymously as well. So if a student wants to tell us about an issue that's happening in a classroom, or they want to say that here's the name of the person who of my assailant, they can do so through this forum without identifying who they are. So whether or not you choose to disclose your identity, that's really up to you. So we'll take any information, though I think it's important to note that when we receive anonymous reports, sometimes that can hinder how much action we can take, because it's sometimes difficult to know off of an initial report what exactly is going on, and we're not able to contact somebody to get follow-up questions. We do respond to every report, but just know that that is a limitation with anonymous reporting.
And I would also add, talking about that on-call system earlier, these reports are monitored by our on-call staff. So when you file one of these, Meredith and I may get a copy sent to our inbox, but if you file it at 8 o'clock on a Friday, she and I may be, watching a movie and don't get it. But we have an on-call person who's checking that inbox every so often. And so, for emergency situations, we do highly recommend that someone call TUPD. But if a student does file a report at 11 o'clock on Friday saying, I think my friend was assaulted this evening, the on-call person will see it either that evening or when they wake up the next morning and be able to respond pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. In the residence halls, we would always suggest reach out to an RA if you want immediate assistance that night, because the RA can trigger the on-call system. But.
Yeah.
So let's then move on into what our policies and procedures are at Tulane. Now you know that we have these strong response systems. What is it that we're actually talking about? So for us, we've got some conduct that just is not allowed within our community. As Julia mentioned, sexual harassment. This is, I think, a really insidious issue, not only in colleges, but across the nation. This would be defined as unwanted communication or behaviors of a sexual nature that either are in a quid pro quo situation, so that classic, if you sleep with me, I'll give you a job or a raise. But also it's these unwanted communications or behaviors that create a hostile environment. Things that are either so severe, so persistent, or so pervasive that they poison the educational environment and prevent a student from being able to concentrate and to fully enjoy their educational opportunity. I was investigated a case where a student was being sexually harassed by her physics lab partner, and with his constant comments and behaviors towards her, she wasn't able to attend class anymore because it was such a hostile environment. So this can come from other peers, but a real concern is from faculty and staff, just because of the power positions that these people have over students. It's also important to note that this includes gender-based harassment. Now, this is harassment on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, or as we like to say, who you are and who you love. These are no basis for discrimination or harassment, and we take that just as seriously as the more commonly known sexual harassment. And it's important to note that this doesn't need to be sexual in nature. A lot of gender-based harassment isn't necessarily a come on, but targeted harassment because of someone's sexual orientation or identity. So these two really come together. Then we look at some of the forms of sexual violence. First, sexual assault. This falls under sexual harassment as part of that hostile environment. I said before that it has to be either so severe, so persistent, or so pervasive. This is the so severe. This is defined broadly as unwanted sexual contact, which includes an entire range of behaviors from people who touch other people's intimate areas, all the way up to rape, which we don't use the term rape. We do use sexual assault because rape is a criminal term. And in fact, rape is not the criminal term that every state uses. So instead, we talk about sexual assault because that's the behavior in question. So when you look at the statistics about sexual assault on college campuses, sexual assault is that really broad category, and then they'll usually break out the behaviors that we more commonly call rape, but that's a part of this larger overarching term. But the main thing I think about sexual assault is that it really boils down to consent, and I think that most of the cases that we deal with, have questions. These are questions of consent. Was consent achieved? So having a conversation with your student about consent is really important. It's defined within our Code of Student Conduct as mutual agreement for sexual activity. And let me pause there. I know that when we have conversations on consent, students and sometimes members of our community, faculty, staff, and parents will say, so does that mean that you're expecting my child or me to sit down and actually sign a contract with the other person before we can have this mutually agreed upon sexual activity? No, not at all. That's not what consent is. Consent is something that is so much more simple than that. I think just the way that we discuss it can seem a little intimidating. It's really just informed, voluntary, and active agreement saying, would you like to do this? Yeah, it can be that simple. Consent cannot be given by force, due to threats, cannot be coerced, and cannot be given when somebody is incapacitated. You can be incapacitated by a number of things, by sleep, for example, but also I think more commonly the conversation is around drugs or alcohol. And I want to really emphasize that there is a difference between drunk and incapacitated. Sometimes that line between how drunk is too drunk, that can get a little gray, but this isn't, the discussion that we have at Tulane is not about you can't have a few drinks and have sex. It's that students are having a lot more than a few drinks to the point where they are losing motor control or cognitive ability. That's what incapacitated is. And when you see somebody who's having trouble walking, when you see somebody who is badly slurring their words, when you see somebody who is not conscious, they are incapacitated. So this is part of having conversations with our students. So that way they understand how drunk is too drunk. Lastly, it's, second to last actually, is that it's important to know that the person who is initiating the sexual activity has to obtain consent. Just like if you wanted to borrow somebody's car, you would ask, is it okay, Julia, if I borrowed your car? And either she would give me a yes or from the look that she's giving me, I'm pretty sure the answer is no. But I would ask, and we're saying the exact same thing when it comes to sexual activity. Ask first if you want something. Sometimes both students want it at the same time, and that makes that agreement really easy. But it's really the same way that you would treat anything else that you want in life. The most important thing really to emphasize, I'd say, of all of these elements is that silence is not consent. I don't know how many times Julia and I have heard students who say that they felt coerced or pressured into sex and they never said yes. They never said yes. And then if they go through the conduct process, the other student will say, but she didn't say no. He never pushed me off. Well, we're not asking for somebody to have to fight you off or tell you no. You need to know that unless you have a yes or something like a yes, um, you do not have consent. So, moving on to sexual assault, there are a few other forms of sexual violence that we want to highlight. Dating violence, which is starting at about 18 years old. Students or people are moving into the risk age group for into partner violence. So, it's a difficult one for students, and I think that uh, it's very easy to think dating violence would happen to me, especially for students here who are so smart and so engaged. You never think that you'll be the one that falls into an abusive relationship, but it happens. Um, Also, stalking. Stalking is those behaviors, unwanted communications, or following behaviors, monitoring behaviors that can cause fear in another person. And we see this a lot from either former romantic partners or from people who have been rejected for romantic overtures. So you didn't say yes to me the first time I asked you out, so let me try another 20 times because maybe one of those will pan out. And unfortunately, then you see frustration and anger build in the person who's being told no over and over again, and a lot of fear building in the person who is not being heard.
Yeah, and I will say too, I see kind of a double-edged sword of stalking on college campuses. So on the one hand, the fact that you're on a college campus can make it really easy for the perpetrator to have access to the victim and kind of find them in a lot of places or be hanging around in the places where they might be. The flip side of that, though, is that also, like we were talking about earlier, Tulane has a lot of power to try to put some prohibitions and protections in place when a student is saying, hey, this other student's behavior is making me uncomfortable, it's harassment, or it has crossed the line into stalking. We have a lot of ability to put some protections in place.
Mm-hmm. So your students might be telling you something, minimizing it to you. Like, I know that they won't hurt me. It's just really annoying. But then they start describing to you that they're changing the way that they walk around campus, or they no longer go to certain places because they know that person's looking for them. When you're hearing your student trying to minimize that behavior, please tell them that that is not okay and get them as quickly as you can to Julia's office. The last thing that we want to talk about isn't necessarily sexual violence, but is a really pernicious form of sexual misconduct, and that's sexual exploitation. I think Julia, when we were talking about this webinar, she said this one's really important because of how it can manifest most commonly, which would be...
Yeah, so this term has a very broad definition in our code of conduct, but what we most commonly see is students have either voluntarily sent maybe a nude or partially nude photo to a romantic partner, or the romantic partner or whoever has somehow gotten a hold of that picture, not through consensual means. But either way, we're seeing that image or video being shared without the person in the image or video's knowledge and or consent. Which just makes you feel gross all over. But unfortunately, that's something that I think not only Tulane, but just universities and institutions across the country have seen a rise in. I know Louisiana has passed some legislation in recent years related to this. It's just kind of an emerging issue with all of the technology that we have today.
Yeah. So all of this prohibited conduct, then, this plays into that required response that we have from Title IX. So know that we have provided a lot of support to our victim survivors, but at the same time, we have an obligation to investigate issues that come to us, and that we have this responsibility that even if there is a concurrent criminal investigation, let's say into a sexual assault, that doesn't obviate our responsibility to respond to these issues, because these are prohibited conducts here at the university. And we're not in the habit of saying, well, this type of behavior is okay, even though it's prohibited. So we have to respond. But a student is able to say to us, here's what's going on. All I want is the support from victim services, and to send a letter to my professor explaining why I missed class because I was meeting with a counselor. And that's it. And as a university, then we can weigh and usually respect the wishes of that student to not proceed forward with conduct. But we do assume an investigation is going to take place and are ready for that. If a student says to us, yes, let's go. Or sometimes the institution will say, we need to move forward because you have shared with us details that are so concerning to us. Or we're seeing a pattern of behavior here from a particular student that is so concerning that we have to respond to this with our disciplinary process. And that process is outlined in our Tulane University code. So this is a brand new code for us actually this year that's administered by the Office of Student Conduct. That's where all of the prohibited sexual violence is outlined. And so if a student has committed any of those acts against another student and we move forward with a disciplinary investigation, that process is outlined here in the code. And the Office of Student Conduct, they're the office that takes care of those issues, and they will first meet with the student to explain their process. That whole system is very detailed, and so we want to make sure that our students are well supported. So we have advisors that we can provide. Julia's office is always there to be an advocate for our students. So if you have a student who is going through this process, the Office of Student Conduct is the one who handles those student investigations. But I do want to know that there is another office, that's the Office of Institutional Equity. They handle investigations into misconduct by faculty and staff. So as Julia was talking before, we'll receive complaints about sexual harassment from faculty or staff. And then OIE will investigate that. There is a code of conduct for all of us employees. Julia and I are also subject to it. And so if there were allegations against employees, OIE investigates using the equal opportunity policies. And if faculty and staff are found responsible, then we are subject to the same outcomes as students. We can be fired from the institution. So there's a whole range of things. So know for your students that if they tell you my professor is doing X, Y, or Z, that we have an entire office who handles that as well, those investigations as well. Though I'll add, if your student has been a victim of conduct, either sexual harassment, discrimination, or violence by a faculty or staff member, the resources are the ones that we outlined before. Like, things don't change in terms of support if the assailant or the harasser is as a grown-up versus a fellow student.
Yeah, and I also, Meredith just reminded me of something else that I want to share with you all. Students who may have experienced assaults prior to their time at Tulane, whether that was, they were sexually assaulted in high school by a classmate, or they were victims of child abuse when they were younger, they can still come to my office for support and resources if they're still in the process of healing from that experience.
Yeah, that's a great note. And I know that some parents may have, and families may have already contacted us to say, my student is coming in, or I am coming in with some things that I know that I'll need some extra support right off the bat. And at my previous institution, actually, we had a couple families who would come in and meet with us to say, this thing happened during senior year or earlier, and I'm still working through it. What are the support resources like here? How do I get connected and be really proactive? So if in these final days before school begins, or even after school begins, that you want to have that conversation, we're here. So now we've discussed all of the things that we do when we learn about these incidents. But the big thing is, how are we going to prevent this from ever happening? And we put an incredible amount of energy into this portion of the work. So it's not just about responding, but it's about prevention. So how do you actually prevent sexual violence? Well, you're looking at three big areas: dealing with alcohol, dealing with rape culture, and dealing with bystander behavior. So what do we mean by those? Well, let's start with alcohol. I'm sure you're shocked to hear that in New Orleans, there's a lot of alcohol consumption. In fact, you should see, just for fun, just type in New Orleans alcohol into Google Images and just see what pops up. Um, there is a lot here. And because of that, then the connections we already know exist between alcohol and sexual violence can be exacerbated in this community. First is that there's a really clear correlation between high alcohol consumption and victimization. But there's also the same correlation between high alcohol consumption and perpetrating sexual violence. So this, when we talk about this though, we're talking not only about somebody who is binge drinking regularly. So I get drink a lot in one setting often, but also in this single night, I'm going to have 9 drinks. And I know 9 drinks sounds so much, but when you're not as old as we are, and 9 drinks sounds like that's just a Friday. So, but that carries a lot of risk, and in a lot of different areas, not just sexual violence, but in sexual violence, it's particularly acute because of this really well-researched connection between high alcohol consumption, victimization, and perpetration. The way that we talk about alcohol, I think, is pretty well summed up here in this next point, which is that alcohol is the #1 date rape drug. It's not roofies. It's not GHB. It's alcohol. And often students will think that they have been drugged because they don't actually understand how much alcohol they had. For example, if you're getting like a punch, let's say, like at a house party, and it looks like it's just one solo, like red solo cup full of punch, but really inside that one cup is like 4 shots. Well, if I have 2 drinks or 2 cups, I've actually just had 8 drinks, maybe in only 30 minutes. So students don't even fully understand what they're consuming, and that can either be used, somebody can take advantage of that fact.
Yeah. And I really want to emphasize, we do talk about this when we're talking about prevention from a community perspective. This is not, though, how a conversation would look if a student came into my office and is telling me they were assaulted over the weekend and had 9 drinks the night they were assaulted. I'm not going to say, and an investigator in student conduct or our police aren't going to say, well, when you have 9 drinks in one night, that really ups your risk for victimization. So on a micro level, when we're working one-on-one with students, we work really hard to make sure they're not feeling blamed for any choices they made, because ultimately it's the perpetrator who made the choice to assault them. But like Meredith is saying, we're looking at this from that macro level, from how do we intervene in a community level. We do have to look at how do we tackle alcohol, because like she demonstrated, alcohol and sexual violence are so intertwined.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it's always good to emphasize nobody ever invites victimization. There's nothing a person can do to justify being sexually assaulted ever. But there's something that we know, lastly, about alcohol that I want to emphasize, and this is really important when we think about not victimization, but perpetration, which is that when you've consumed a lot of alcohol, a lot of dumb things happen because alcohol affects those parts in the brain that actually puts like the brake on our more risk-taking behaviors. And it also really affects the part of our frontal cortex that's able to look at an ambiguous situation and see that this is not black and white, but instead there's more ambiguity. And that really comes up with issues of consent, where let's say that instead of trying to tell a person, no, I don't want to have sex with you, you're trying to do it in a more like polite, gentle way, because maybe this person is a friend, or you just feel really uncomfortable. So you do the whole, maybe I'm feeling a little tired, or I really should go home and see how my roommate's doing. Instead of reading that as, well, as you and I and Julia are probably all going, that's somebody who does not want to be there. Alcohol makes it really hard for a person to see that that's a really ambiguous statement. Instead, they're looking for that no. So that's a connection with alcohol that's really only been discovered in the past few years, but gosh, does that impact consent issues. So what we're doing to then deal with this is that we're doing increased alcohol education, so that way our students understand the impact of alcohol on their brains. As my uncle, the anesthesiologist, said, alcohol is not a depressant, it's an anesthetic. So how do you understand how this is anesthetizing parts of your brain? And also bystander training. So that way, when they are in situations where friends are drinking, they're able to intervene and prevent some really dangerous activities. Also, we're going to increase our enforcement of the alcohol policy. We have an alcohol policy. Shock. It is still illegal in Louisiana and New Orleans to be drinking if you're under the age of 21. And so our students, if they are making it very obvious that they are drinking under the age of 21, they can expect to face consequences, not just from the university, but from the police. And lastly, we're developing a campus-wide plan for engaging on issues around alcohol. And this is being led out of our student health, the Department of Student Health. And in particular, we have an office called The Well, that engages on issues of sexual violence, mental health, and alcohol. Julie, I'm in the provost office. Julie is within student affairs. Is there anything that you would add to that in the conversations that have been had there?
I mean, I think from those of us in student affairs, we truly see this as a partnership. So the Well and Student Health are definitely taking the lead on this, but they are working extremely closely with my office, who meets with students after they've had an alcohol transport. They're working closely with housing, who supervises the RAs who may be seeing some of this behavior going on in the residence halls. We're working with partners outside of student affairs, like Meredith's office. So even though, yes, the Well is taking the lead on this, they're not alone in fighting this battle. This is a collaborative effort, and student affairs and the rest of the university leadership are saying this is important and we need to tackle this issue.
Absolutely. The next issue that we see really contributing to sexual assault is rape culture. And you might wonder, what is rape culture? This is a quotation from the 2016 Freshman Reading Project book called Asking for It by Kate Harding, which was on issues of sexual assault and sexual violence in America. And I think it's really simply said, it's a culture where we blame victims, where we disbelieve victims, and where we act like rape is both uncommon and trivial, normalizing sexual assault.
Yeah, and I think, one of the most pernicious effects of this that I see is that it causes victims to question themselves and their own experience, and oftentimes causes their friends and family to question them, which are the people that, we expect to be able to rely on the most when in our times of need. One of the effects of rape culture is that we sometimes, when you hear the word rapist, you think of this scary boogeyman jumping out at you from behind bushes or in a dark alley late at night. When really on college campus, perpetrators look like the guy from your algebra class or that cute girl you've been making eyes with at the bar all night. And so, like I said, one of, I think, the most harmful effects of this is that I see so many victims who come into my office and they're questioning, well, I don't really know if it was rape though, because he's such a nice guy and I never would have expected this. Or, I told my friend about this and she asked me why I was drinking so much that evening. And so I think that's personally for me, one of the most heartbreaking effects is that I see how it hurts survivors and inhibits their ability to heal.
Mm-hmm. I think that we need to really change our conversation to understand that sexual violence is something it is something that happens, and that anybody could perpetrate this. There isn't a particular form of person, because I think our students will often say, my friends would never do this. And we hurt each other every day, do really mean things to each other every day. But somehow our cultural conversation does not acknowledge that in all of the bad things that people can do, rape is one of them. And so we're trying to change that conversation, because if we can acknowledge that, then just like all of the other things that we now talk about and say, this is not okay, that can join it. So what are we doing to deal with this? Well, we're combating rape culture by we've created a university-wide coalition. It's been in place now for a couple of years, about 3 years now.
3 or 4 years. Yeah, it's evolved.
Yeah, it's a university-wide coalition that is made up of faculty, staff, and students who talk about how we can prevent and educate our community when it comes to issues of sexual violence. We have education for our students from peer groups like SAFE, and then the Tufts, who are the Tulane University peer health educators. That PH is pronounced like an F. It took me like 5 months to learn. And also, there's education from me. In fact, a major portion of my job is to go around to not only students, but faculty and staff to do a lot of education on these issues. We have programs like Take Back the Night, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is April, the Clothesline Project, which allows victims to actually you.
Yeah, so this is a project that SAFE takes on every year, and victims can come and decorate shirts with messages about their assault or their healing. Friends and allies can also come decorate shirts, and then we display them in buildings on campus like the LBC, which is kind of the hub of student life, like, the Carolyn Richardson building, which has a lounge in there that a lot of our students use, so that students are seeing messages about sexual violence, dating violence, stalking, and we're raising awareness for those issues and also allowing survivors an outlet for expression.
Like I mentioned before, last year, our entire freshman class, which is about 1,800 students plus, read a book about sexual violence. And we think that from what we can tell, we think that we're the only school so far that has asked for its reading project for the entering book to be about sexual violence. And we're really proud of how that opened up new conversations in our hall. And I'd also say that our freshman class from last year, they seem to be really engaged on this topic. So
yeah, we got an overwhelmingly positive response from students about the book. And I have to be honest, we were a little afraid at first that they were all going to hate it or revolt against us. And that didn't happen.
No.
A lot of them said, I'm so relieved that Tulane felt like this was important and wanted us to have a conversation about this.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll get to do it again. But at the very least, you can make this your own book project and go out and purchase this. It's still available as a free ebook for students. So your student can now download that from the library like tonight, and it's totally free. We also include on all we encourage our faculty to put on their syllabi language for victims to seek support, where resources are, and to let them know that they confide with their professor. The professor will share that forward. The Newcomb College Institute has a speaker series that involves sexual violence issues. And then lastly, we did complete a campus climate survey in the winter of 2017. We're currently analyzing the data. We received a nearly 50% response rate, which is really incredible. Most schools see about 19% of their students. But like I said, our student body, and in particular our freshman class, are very engaged on this issue. And from this, then we're taking that data to create programs that are going to be more Tulane specific, because it's really responding to what victimization and perpetration look like here. So I think it's important then to say that this is what we're trying to do here is from the moment that students come to our campus, from the experiences that they have here, the good ones, these fantastic moments that they're having with each other, that they understand that preventing sexual violence has to be a part of their activities, because the fun that you have is lessened when somebody is hurt. So sometimes you might need to dial back on what you want to do, because you know that if the other person doesn't want to do it, that's not as important as what you want, which I think really is an issue with sexual violence, is that one person's wants are more important than the other. Here we're telling students that the fun you have is magnified when you're all in this together. So the way that we really push this is through our bystander program, which is called the One Wave program, where we teach students how to stand speak up and act and intervene in situations where they think that one person is trying to hurt another. The best experiences that you have are shared here. So how do we keep our community safe and healthy?
Yeah, and I appreciate Meredith talking about community because really for me, efforts like One Wave are part of a larger value at Tulane of living in a community and learning what it means to look out for one another. I'm not going to say our motto in Latin, but Tulane's motto translates to not for oneself, but for one's own. And so we really want students to live and breathe that value. And I feel like bystander intervention is a perfect fit for that because it's about looking out for your community.
This is where we add that Julia is a Tulane alum.
I am.
So here are a few future events for you to put onto your calendar and hopefully nudge your student as well, which is first, we're going to have an event here in September called Shifting the Paradigm, where we're really trying to promote prevention efforts at the university. And also we'll share what our yearly data is for how many reports we've received, how many people go through conduct. Also, the undergraduate student government is going to be hosting a town hall on sexual violence issues on October 3rd. Take Back the Night. Julia, do we have a date on that?
We do. That will be on October 25th.
All right.
And one of the things that I love about this event, speaking of community, is that it is a joint venture between Tulane, Loyola, Dillard, Xavier, UNO, Holy Cross College. So New Orleans has a pretty decent number of universities here, and we bring together all of those campuses to march at Take Back the Night and listen to survivors and their stories and show our support.
Yeah. And then, of course, we'll be releasing our climate survey results. Right now, it's a little TBD because we're still analyzing and then developing an action plan. So once we have that complete, somewhere in the late fall, maybe early winter, we're not sure. But our researchers are actively digging on in there. I've learned so much about research. It's like I've just gotten a brand new master's. So here is the last thing, which is what you and your student can do to be a part of this. First is that if you need to know this, that your student might experience sexual violence while they're here. And so how do you respond to that?
Yeah, and I know this is a really difficult thing to think about. No one wants to think about their child being a victim of violence. But I do encourage you to think of what are some things you would want to say to your student if that were to happen. So some good things to say are, I believe you. I'm sorry this happened. You're not alone. I'm here to help you. What can I do? What do you need from me? And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our students struggle with blame. So not, emphasizing to them they're not to blame. It wasn't your fault. And making sure that you're not questioning what they did or interrogating them. And I especially want to emphasize, a lot of times I do see parents start to question their students' decisions. And I get it. Your child is the most precious thing in the world to you. Something bad has happened to them. You want to figure out and make sure your student knows how to avoid basically ever having something bad happen to them again. I get it that those questions and maybe sometimes the statements about you should or shouldn't have done this are coming from a place of caring and just wanting to make sure they're safe. But that can really amplify the blame. And so really just focusing on, I'm here for you. What can I do?
Yeah. And then you can set the tone here. Have a conversation with your student about sex, consent, and healthy relationships. I know these are really difficult subjects to talk about, but if you do, it's really going to help. Talk about media, good representation and bad. How about Game of Thrones? That's a good place to start. Read books like Asking for It. Also, American Hookup by Lisa Wade is really great, talking about sexual relationships in college campuses and how our students really want to connect with each other. And also Missoula by John Krakauer, which is about the issues with the University of Montana and the city of Missoula and how they were really trying to suppress reporting at their university. Read our policies, learn about our programs, and encourage your student to attend. And please tell your student that if they are receiving surveys or asked to participate in focus groups, Their answer is yes, I'd love to. And lastly, set expectations with your student about how you expect them to behave as a bystander. If you're telling your student that, as a member of our family, this is what we expect from each other, that you take care of each other, that'll really help. So as we then wrap up, here's our contact information. It'll be up for you to receive, and we're also going to be sending it out in the newsletter that Penny will have. Thank you so very much for your time. Thank you. We really appreciate it. And
thank you.
let us know if there's anything that we can do. Here's to a great year.